Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's Surface Measurement Systems webinar. The title of today's session is Physicochemical Characterization of Geologic Materials, and we're very lucky to be joined by Dr. Elizabeth Denis from the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory and by Dr. Annette Condor from Surface Measurement Systems. Before we get into the presentations, I'd like to highlight that we have a live Q&A at the end of the session today. So please do submit your question for our speaker at any point throughout the presentation using the questions function in the webinar control panel, and these questions will be asked in the live Q&A at the end. So once again, please submit your questions for the speaker in the live Q&A panel. Before we get into our main presentation, we'd like to start with just a quick word from Annette Condor on an exciting update to the IGC SEA instrument, which we think you'd all be very interested to know. So I will pass over to Annette quickly to give her presentation.
Yeah, thank you, John. I hope everybody can see.
Yeah, all good, Annette.
The slides, all good. Okay. So yes, as John mentioned, just a couple words about the new developments on IGC. We did in the last couple of years, and finally it got to the point to officially release. We have a new product on our IGC product line. It's called IGC SEA Nova, and it's specially for high temperature application. The column oven has a wide temperature range from 30 Celsius up to 500 Celsius degree. Besides this, it has the same features as our standard IGC system. So fully automated. The injection system is based on headspace injection. So we inject from the gas phase, and it has a very user-friendly software control and analysis. This instrument is mainly for applications on carbon, zeolite, and materials with really high surface area, and applications where customers need to know what's the surface energy or what's the properties of the product at really high temperature. Because it's focusing on a different market than our standard IGC, we did a couple studies using this product. One of that is on activated carbon, carbon black, which is used in batteries or fuel cell or in conductive papers. We determined the surface energy of this carbon black, and the study is available. If you're interested in, just please contact with us, and we can share you the details with you. We also did a study on zeolite, different temperatures, just to investigate how the temperature can affect the surface energy of zeolites. Zeolites are usually very well designed, engineered materials, but there's a temperature or there's conditions where they start to kind of a little bit change. For example, in case of this zeolite, 400 degrees C seems something's happening, whereas the surface energy gets a bit more heterogeneous, and it's not anymore that uniform, and which probably can affect the performance of this zeolite. IGC has a wide applications and so many different physical-chemical properties you can determine, and these properties really helps to understand and to design and develop the processing of your materials. If you're interested in our new product, please do not hesitate to contact with us. But it's a great pleasure for me to give the floor now to Elizabeth, and but first John probably introduce her. And thank you for joining today for us, Elizabeth, and accepting the invitation. And look forward to hear your presentation.
Thank you very much, Annette. Yes, and as promised, I'm happy to now introduce Dr. Elizabeth H. Denis from the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. Elizabeth has been a very good friend to Surface Measurement Systems over the years and always helps us out in these kind of endeavors. So I'd like to extend a special thanks to her before her presentation. So without further ado, we will now jump to Dr. Denis to present on the title Physicochemical Characterization of Geologic Materials.
Great, thank you. I really appreciate the introduction and being here. I'm going to try to share my screen and can confirm that you can see my presentation.
That's great. Yeah.
Yes.
Looks good. Okay.
Yes.
Excellent. So yes, thank you everyone for being here, and thank you SMS for hosting this webinar. My name is Elizabeth Denis, and I'm a chemist at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, which is located in Washington State in the US. And I'm a geochemist by training, so both a geology and chemistry background. Today I'm sharing with you some of our work we are doing to determine the physical chemical properties of geologic materials to better understand and predict subsurface gas transport. So before I get started, I would like to note this disclaimer in brief that reference herein to any specific commercial product, process, or service does not necessarily imply its endorsement by the United States government or any agency thereof, or Battelle Memorial Institute. The views and opinions of authors expressed herein do not necessarily state or reflect those of the United States government or any agency thereof. Also, before I get started with more of the presentation, I do really want to acknowledge our funding sources, collaborators, and several key personnel at PNNL that continue to be part of this work. And so yeah, this is the main core team here is myself, and then Nick, Mark, Angelica, Gui, and April. And this really is a combination of both experimental chemists as well as geologists and modelers so that we can make this the results that you see here, and they really have been a team effort. So thank you. For the outline of my talk, there's going to be two main sections. In the first section, I will be talking about how we determine the absorption properties of a suite of geologic materials using inverse gas chromatography, the IGC. And for the second part of the talk, I will discuss how we are integrating these experimental measurements integrating them with subsurface gas transport models to help predict how gases would be transported in the real world environment. And I'll go over some challenges and also initial results from these modeling experiments. So it's important to understand the absorption of chemical compounds in the environment because absorption affects compounds' transport, degradation, volatilization, and availability for uptake by organisms. What we're doing, we're quantifying absorption parameters to help determine the parameters for computational subsurface gas transport models. And then all this information can be used to estimate the extent of a release of a chemical underground, for example, and help predict migration to the surface. And so I have this example, the figure at right, how this is a subsurface geologic column. You have lots of different materials, and it's important to understand the extent to which a chemical might be retained by a given material and therefore either be stuck in it or travel slowly through it, or how quickly the chemical may move through various materials. And that could be based on particle size or both chemical and material properties. So that's what we're looking into. So our goals are to understand the chemistry of gas-solid interactions to strengthen predictive models of subsurface gas transport. Our main questions are how are volatile compounds transported through geologic media, whether that be soil, sand, clays, and then also between different geologic layers. So if you're imagining how those compounds would be transported through the subsurface. And then within that, what are the effects of temperature and humidity on the gas-solid absorption interactions? So I'll talk to some of that in this presentation. Our objectives are twofold, and that is what leads to the two sections of this presentation. So our first objective is to measure the physical chemical properties of a variety of soils and geologic materials using the inverse GC. The IGC allows us to probe a solid material with a variety of gases to measure a suite of parameters related to absorption and material transport. At PNL, we actually have two IGCs. One is as shown above with the flame ionization detector. And with that one, we can look at organic gases. And then we also have an in-house IGC that's with a mass spectrometer. So we can look also at non-organic gases like noble gases. The parameters that we're measuring, as Annette said, there's a wide variety of parameters that you could look at. We've mainly focused so far on Henry's constant, which is a type of partition coefficient, and enthalpy or heat of absorption, which is essentially a measure of the heat released when a gas absorbs to a solid material. And then the third component is diffusion coefficient, is the other primary one that we've been looking at. For the purpose of this talk, I will focus mainly on the Henry's constant and heat of absorption results, but I do provide references to some of our publications at the end for more information on diffusion coefficient if that's something you're interested in. The second objective is to integrate the experimentally determined parameters with the gas transport model. And this is really to help strengthen modeling capabilities and better predict chemical migration. So these actual experimental measurements help provide context for what you'd expect in the real world environment. So we're looking at a suite of geologic materials. Here are just a few examples. We're characterizing, they tend to be powdered or sieved materials. These include heterogeneous materials like soils. So we have two different soils in this case that are both, they're different types of loam, which is a combination of sand, silt, and clay. We're also looking at tuff, which is a porous rock that's formed from the consolidation of volcanic ash. And then we also are looking at single minerals like quartz sand and bentonite clay. The idea being that understanding these simpler minerals, they're constituents of the more complex geologic materials that we're looking at. And then because the soil and geologic materials are inherently heterogeneous, we also evaluated a homogeneous sorbent called 10xTA. This is a porous polymer sorbent. And we did this to help assess the variability in our measurements versus just the variability that's innate to other materials. The geologic materials have a range of organic carbon contents, which I've shown down here. So in this case, ranging at most, we had about 4% down to just a little bit over 0.1%. And this can further add to that variability in results or heterogeneity. And then just to give people a perspective, if you aren't as familiar with inverse GC, this is a picture of a packed IGC column, in this case filled with about 3 grams of the sieved dry soil. So we're using inverse GC. The Earth's subsurface is much like a column of stacked materials, and we are using the IGC to emulate volatile compound transport. Just like a gas might migrate through a real-world soil column, we are using IGC to measure the level of interaction between the uncharacterized solid material and known probe gases by varying temperature, humidity, and carrier gas flow. What we did is we injected a pulse of a known probe gas through the packed column, and then determine the material absorption properties based on the width and the resulting peak and its retention time relative to an unretained species. And in this case, the unretained species is methane. So that's just a little bit of background on the method. I'm going to now jump into results. For the first, I'm going to talk about heat of absorption. And these are box plots of heat of absorption, so kilojoules per mole on the y-axis for a suite of materials. The different materials are on the x-axis. And just to get you oriented with this plot, I know it's a lot of information, but for reference, the letters that you see above and below the box plots they mark the statistical significance of our results. So where boxes that do not share a letter are statistically different. For example, the salt and calcium carbonate down here with the lowest heat of absorption, they both have the letter A, which means they are not statistically different from each other, but they are statistically different from others that do not share a letter A. So all the other geologic materials are statistically different. We also made replicate measurements on multiple sample columns, and this figure provides a summary of all the individual measurements, which is noted by the N by each box plot. On the right, I've provided a summary of seeing how the heat of absorption results stack up for the different geologic materials. The key things that you might notice is that the polymer 10xTA has the highest heat of adsorption, and then the soil and clay have a greater affinity for the probe gas octane than calcium carbonate and salt, and you really get these two different groups located here. Tuff and quartz sand fall between these end members, and we suspect that the greater absorption of the soil and clay is likely due to the complex nature of the bonding sites and the organic matter in the soil compared to the simpler minerals like sand, calcium carbonate, and salt, which don't have any organic matter and are much simpler structures. The second set of results is related to Henry's constant. So this is a type of partition coefficient that describes the concentration of a gas absorbed onto a material. In this case, it's the solid material, the geologic material, but traditionally it's dissolved in a liquid. So these are gas sorbing onto the different geologic materials. Again, the probe gas is octane. We looked at the suite of materials. On the y-axis, we have Henry's constant, and on the x-axis is temperature. If you have a larger Henry's constant, that's indicating a greater affinity or absorption of a gas for a material relative to another gas with a smaller Henry's constant. Based on our results, we were able to differentiate between the materials, and you can see that for all the materials, they have that downward trend where the partitioning of the vapor on the material decreased with increased temperature, which is what we'd expect, that the higher temperatures, then you're favoring more being in the gas phase rather than absorbing onto the solid material. Overall, the materials were divided into two groups again, and in this case, we have the more absorptive materials having the higher Henry's constant, and then the less absorptive materials like the calcium carbonate, salt, having the lower Henry's constant value. And then one thing I do want to note is that it's the relative order of magnitude values can depend on temperature, since each material has slightly different trendline slopes. And so what I mean by that is if you can imagine extrapolating these out, and if they follow a straight line, for example, this soil number 2 at lower temperatures might actually have a lower heat absorption than the 10xTA, just because of how the trendline slope is. So that's something to keep in mind when you're looking at different temperatures. And then, so on this slide, I've stacked up the results for the Henry's constant and for the heat absorption for the same materials. So that's what I'm showing on the right. And then this is still just the same Henry's constant plot on the left. And then you still see the two main groups with like more absorptive materials and less absorptive. But although the differentiation is similar in regards to the two main groups, a larger heat of adsorption doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have a greater Henry's constant value. So it's important to, make both measurements and get to understand your materials in this context. And then you can see, for example, quartz sand. In the case of Henry's constant, it looks more similar to the calcium carbonate salt, whereas with heat of adsorption, it's more similar to the more kind of falls between the absorptive end member of the spectrum. So another material that we've started looking at, and actually Annette Condor has spoke to this with their high temperature inverse GC, is looking at zeolites. So zeolites, we've been investigating to just see how they compare to our other geologic materials that we measured. And for those not familiar, zeolites are microporous crystalline aluminous silicate materials, and their unique adsorption, molecular sieve, and catalytic properties are of interest for a range of commercial uses. We're investigating both natural and synthetic zeolites. And then here's just a picture for reference of a zeolitic tuff on the right here. So for this talk, I'm going to focus on the Henry's constant of zeolitic materials. The three materials we looked at are the synthetic zeolite 13X, and then two natural zeolites, KMI, and tuff, which is a combination of the clinoptilite and mordanite. So for these results, I've now taken that plot that you just saw previously with the Henry's constant versus temperature, and I've now highlighted and added the zeolitic data onto the plot so you can see how it compares to the other geologic materials. The natural zeolites you can see down here, so tuff is the yellow triangle, the KMI is the light blue asterisk. They're more similar to the more absorptive geologic materials we had analyzed previously, so like the soils and the clays. But really notably that zeolite 13X, the synthetic zeolite, is distinct from the natural zeolites as well as the other materials. And this really stands out. So in terms of magnitude, the partition coefficient for the synthetic zeolite is nearly two orders of magnitude greater than other zeolites. And I think this really just speaks to those properties that I mentioned that people are interested in for the absorptive properties and molecular sieve that people use zeolites commercially. So up to this point, the measurements I've been showing have been of materials at temperatures less than 150 degrees, and that's because of the upper limits of our instrument. Based on these results, at the lower temperatures, we have extrapolated what the values would be at higher temperatures. And so what I have shown here is that zeolite 13X, the synthetic zeolite, and we have our measurements marked with the blue X's from 110 to 130 degrees Celsius. And then I just did a linear extrapolation out to 500 degrees Celsius. As Annette mentioned at the beginning of this talk, they now have an instrument that has a higher temperature IGC that makes measurements up to 500 degrees Celsius. So we collaborated with them and sent in a few test samples so that they could analyze them on high temperature IGC. And I have these results now showed in comparison. So with the SMS results, they're the red circles. They made measurements at 100 degrees, 300, 400, and 500. And then we have the dashed lines just to see how the two results compare. And what's really exciting is that the high temperature results compare well with our P&L predictions. So for example, at 300 degrees Celsius and 400 degrees Celsius, the measurements were within a factor of 2 of our predictions. And then at 500 degrees Celsius within a factor of 6. So this has twofold implications. One is that it provides some realistic uncertainty for what your predicted values might be. And that's useful for model inputs, so you kind of have a sense of what the end members and what you can expect. And then further, this highlights the ability to extrapolate measurements at different temperatures, but also that it's important to keep in mind that there could be material changes at higher temperatures. So you can extrapolate, but of course it's always best if you are able to make the measurements at the temperature of interest. So with that, I'm going to switch gears to the second part of the talk, which is highlighting integrating of our experimental measurements with the subsurface gas transport model. And this is a work in progress, so I'm just going to talk through it as an introduction, some challenges and initial results of our modeling experiments. So for modeling, we are using STOMP, which is P&L developed its subsurface transport over multiple phases simulator. And this is really used to model gas transport in the subsurface. STOMP simulates coupled thermal, hydrologic, mechanical, and chemical processes. So there's a lot of details here that I'm not going to go into. But for our purposes with this work that I've been talking about, our primary focus is on gas transport and sorption in the dry porous media of different types. And so the components that we're mainly using within the subsurface transport model STOMP is the thermal component and the hydrologic component. Some of the capabilities in STOMP that are needed for modeling these and related experiments include equations of state that cover a wide range of pressure and temperature conditions, and the ability to model a full range of aqueous saturations, including the oven dry conditions that we've been using with the inverse GC. So we are evaluating these gas transport experiments using a kinetic Langmuir model for gas sorption onto the porous media. So one of the overarching questions in integrating experimental and modeling results is, how do you take the inverse GC data and apply it at different spatial and temporal scales? For example, how do you scale up benchtop experiments to models to predict that real life environment? And this schematic at right is kind of showing what we're working and trying to do. So an iterative process between experimentation, modeling, and then seeing what you see in the real world environment for vapor transport to the surface. So within this, there are multiple steps in the process. And our goals are to create a model that simulates the inverse GC conditions. To start, we are using quartz sand as our geologic material and the partition coefficient measurement as our starting parameter. We chose this because the quartz sand is simpler and better characterized material of those analyzed so far. So we're starting the simpler, and then we'll work up to more challenging materials. And then partition coefficient is already a parameter that's used in the STOMP model, so that's why we decided to start with that. One of the key components of this was determining what information the modelers need and what parameters will need to be estimated. And then also just understanding the details of the experimental setup. So for example, understand the calculations and the operations behind the black box of the instrument. And this really is like learning a new language that both people can speak, because there's not always, you might be thinking that you're talking about one thing, but then to explain it to a modeler, it's slightly different terminology. And so it really involves trying to understand your system in order to model it. Within this, once that initial model is created, we're validating the model by adjusting the input file and assumptions to match the inverse GC results. And then this is an iterative process to see how they compare. So on the right is a figure of the cylindrical model of an inverse GC column. So the dimensions are matching, where on the x-axis you have the radius 2 millimeters, and then the y-axis is the length of the column up to 250 millimeters. So that would be the length of your geologic material within the IGC column. And what we started simulating is the octane injection into quartz sand. The different colors in this model indicate the different octane concentrations. So the red in this case is the highest concentration, and then you can see lower concentrations on either side of it. So if this were to reach the detector, you get a nice peak. The cylindrical models were calibrated to the carrier gas flow rate by adjusting the permeability of the material to achieve a match of the pressure drop across the column that you see experimentally in lab. So here's some initial results that we have of the simulated versus experimental conditions. This plot on the right shows the simulated results, which are solid lines, compared to the observed inverse GC experiment results, which are the dashed lines. The methane peak is shown in green. That's the quote inert gas in the inverse GC experiment that's assumed to not interact much with the solid material. There is some interaction, but not much. And then the octane, that's the probe gas. And you can note how, especially with the octane, that there's peak tailing in the observed experiment with IGC, but we haven't quite captured that tailing in the modeling experiment. So we were able to match the peak arrival time well, so the max peak height and when that retention time has matched well. But the models that we've done so far, so the equilibrium absorption and the one-site kinetic Langmuir models, do not capture the full extent of the tailing observed experimentally. We think this is due to the heterogeneous interaction with the solid surface. So there's a lot of different active sites, and the gas might be absorbing at different rates. And so our next steps are to explore the use of distributed rate models that could better capture this heterogeneity. So in conclusion, just some key takeaways here that I'd like to highlight is that the inverse GC is effective in analyzing key parameters that are used in modeling subsurface gas transport. So I talked about we have heat of absorption and Henry's constant or partition coefficient, and I showed that you can differentiate between the various geologic materials. And then for diffusion coefficient, I didn't show the results here, but they are captured in our publication from 2021 in Langmuir. And I think our takeaways from the diffusion coefficient, one was that diffusion coefficient increases with temperature. And then another component was that the material differences were less pronounced between just looking at like soils on different materials, but that particle size may be more influential on diffusion rather than the specific type of material. And then the heterogeneous materials like the soil inherently have more variable results, but by comparing our results to the homogeneous sorbent, I didn't go into detail for this talk, but the homogeneous sorbent measurements were well constrained. And so this really highlighted to us that the inverse GC methods are not innately variable. It's really the material is what's causing that variability in the results. Oops. And then another highlight that I was particularly excited about is that predictions can be made for temperatures that are not yet measured. So we showed that we could extrapolate temperatures from around 100 degrees Celsius and extrapolate them out to 500 degrees Celsius and confirm that with the collaboration with SMS at those higher temperature measurements. But it's important to keep in mind that there could still be potential material changes to consider as you heat the material. And then just for my final slide, I really do want to thank everyone for taking the time to listen. I've highlighted here 3 different publications if you're interested in learning more about this work. And certainly if you have any questions or comments, welcome to hear them now. But if you think of anything later, feel free to email me at elizabeth.dennis@pnl.gov. And yeah, thank you. Happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. That was a fantastic presentation. If you don't mind, we will leave the we'll leave it on your screen so that you can jump to any parts of your presentation if you feel they would be illustrative to the questions being asked. But
Okay.
just to remind our audience, you can submit your questions in the questions panel, or alternatively raise your hand, and we will let you unmute. We'll let you know when you can unmute so you can ask the question yourself. This may be more useful if you have a multi-stage question or a bit of a longer, more elaborate question. So just one we've got here already, Elizabeth. Someone has asked, have you made any measurements under different humidity conditions?
Yeah, so we have, what I showed in this presentation was focused on just dry materials, but we have made measurements at different humidities for some of the compounds, and I think I actually have a backup slide. Yes, okay, this is just an example. So one of the compounds we looked at was quartz sand with the probe gas octane, and we measured heat of absorption at different humidities. And in this case, we noted that absorption decreased with humidity, which is saying that the probe gas interacted less with quartz sand at the higher humidities. And what we're thinking is happening is that the gas is likely interacting less with the mineral and increasingly with the water, since octane is a non-polar gas. It also is like not as interested to interact with the polar water. So that was just one of the examples that we've made. And this kind of simulates what we would then see in the subsurface, because you expect that there might be a small percentage of humidity in the subsurface. We've also made some other measurements at humidity. I don't show them here, but that's been a helpful feature to try to emulate what's in the subsurface.
Thank you. We do have a raised hand from Michael Papantanakis. So, Michael, I'll unmute you if you want to unmute yourself so you can ask your question.
Good. So, so you did some nice work characterizing the individual components, the responses of for the Henry constant. Have you thought about moving towards multi-component stacks? So, you know, the combination, and honestly, I've done a lot of the type studies like you've done, but I haven't really thought about multi-components, and if you would make that into beds, you know, run that in different components in series, or if you might do a mixture, or have you thought about that, or how you might execute that if you think start to think towards real world scenarios?
Yeah, so that's exactly what we have been thinking about, and it's a good question that we haven't fully attacked yet. But so you hit two of the ideas that we had was, so if you're looking at a geologic column or a soil column, you imagine that there's multiple layers. So we have thought about adding in like a little bit of zeolite to the quartz sand and seeing how that affects the results. And that could be either stacked or as a mixture. One of the challenges that we've had in like thinking through this is for some of the measurements is like we anticipate that the zeolite would really dominate the signal. And when we're making some of these measurements, so for example, the zeolite, since they're so absorptive, those measurements are usually made over like several hours, whereas quartz sand, octane is really not well retained, and so it'll loop through the system in like a few minutes. So I haven't tested it yet, and that's something that we would like to do, but I do have a feeling that the absorptive material might really dominate, and then you would just not necessarily see what's happening with the quartz sand, just because the conditions you'd have to run it and would have to be for the more absorptive material. But that's something we are interested in looking into.
That sounds like a tricky problem, but
yeah.
But interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I could imagine like setting up, trying to test these hypotheses with different percentage of zeolite, and then really your less absorptive material, make sure you have enough of it to try to capture that as well.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Michael. Another question here, Elizabeth. What do you think could contribute to the material changes you mentioned at higher temperatures?
Yeah, so in the case of the zeolites, I didn't show some of the results, but we also had one of the natural zeolites tested. at the higher temperatures. And in that case, the results really changed a lot from the high temperature 500 degrees Celsius. If you then took the material and went back to a low temperature 100 degrees Celsius measurement, the results were quite shifted. And what we think is happening, at least in the case of the zeolites, is that there's water in the structure. And so at the higher temperatures, there might have been a dewatering effect that we hadn't seen previously. So that's one of the examples. And then another thing that comes to mind, and this is kind of a similar idea. So I think, yeah, I have a slide on this. So in the context of, like, if you think about soils, if you heat them up to a high enough temperature, you can actually remove the organic carbon. And so this is coming at it from a different angle. Our goal is not to measure them at the higher temperatures, but to actually remove the organic carbon and see how that affected our results. And so on this plot, I've highlighted, so we have soil 2, which starts with a 1% carbon, and then by heating it at 460 degrees Celsius, you can remove most of the organic matter. And then we went back and measured that same sample on the inverse GC. So we went from 1% organic carbon to 0.1%. And then in terms of how that affected the heat absorption, the removal of organic carbon actually increased absorption. So now the progas octane was absorbed greater onto the material. And that's actually something I wasn't expecting. But what we think could be happening is that removing the organic carbon maybe opened up active sites that were originally covered by the organic carbon. And now those active sites are available for the progas octane to absorb onto. And then potentially there could have been an impact of, like, decreasing the polarity of surfaces as well, making it more interactive. So that's just a few examples of how temperatures could affect it.
I have to agree. Sorry, I have a small comment on this.
Yeah,
because
that's
also
great.
I showed that surface energy profile of zeolite at different temperature, and what we also observed that at 400 degrees C, the heterogeneity starts to have a little bit higher distribution on the surface, and maybe this, what you mentioned, that higher energy sites opens, so that increase the heterogeneity of zeolite. And the answer for this is, I think it's a very complex. So it's so many things happening, and the heterogeneity, as it's changing with the temperature, and more sites, high energy sites become available, can affect this. So yeah, it's a complex thing, but it's really important to investigate and have some real experimental data at that condition, and then make the model based on those.
Yeah, exactly. And so, like, one thing that this has started us thinking about is, if we want to try to understand how the material have changed, even if we aren't making the measurements at the high temperatures, you could at least heat them in the materials in the oven at the higher temperature, and then go back to a lower temperature to see how it impacts the results, just to get some ideas.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Thank you very much. We have another raised hand here from George Hirasaki. So George, please feel free to unmute yourself when you're ready and ask your question.
Yes, I have a question related to the first about the humidity, because we're talking about the subsurface, and in the subsurface, there's always humidity, and it's more expressed in terms of capillary pressure. And so I know that some people have tried to model very high capillary pressure by changing the relative humidity using electrolytes. And so what do you do? What do you recommend for the subsurface where water is ever present? And we need to know quantitatively how we represent the presence of water.
Yeah, so one of the factors that we've seen, so we've tried to add some humidity to our measurements to compare, and I admit that it's a lot easier to make the measurements if it's oven dry conditions rather than humidity. And I think part of that is, one, you're trying to get, like, the controlled conditions, and with the humidity, I think what sometimes might be happening is that you actually form maybe like a monolayer or some sort of layer of water on your solid surface, and then you're not necessarily getting that gas absorbing with the material itself. That doesn't quite answer the question of like, how do you handle that? And then with the modeling component, that's a similar, we so far have just focused on the dry side, but our subsurface model is set up that you could take into account the humidity. I don't know the details of how they do it offhand, but if you'd like to follow up with me with an email, feel free to send me a note and I could try to provide some more information or discuss with you some of those ideas, because I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, George. Another question here. Just asking in general, you touched on diffusion coefficients in your presentation. Do you have anything further to elaborate on these possibly?
Yeah. So I think I also might have a backup slide, just because I didn't get time to talk about it, but just a quick kind of summary of what we've looked at. In this case, we have 3 different materials, and we are looking at a series of temperatures with diffusion coefficient. And the soil that's what's marked in the circles, and then tough is the triangles, and then we have 10xTA, which is that porous polymer, the homogeneous sorbent that's in the pink or red diamonds. And so the one takeaway here is when you look at the soil, you get a wide variety of results. The different shades represent different material columns. So we have replicate measurements. So all the light blue are replicate measurements of one sample column, but then we had a separate sample column that would be the darker blue. And what stood out to us was that there was less variability between columns of the homogeneous sorbent, so those diamonds here, compared to the heterogeneous soils. And then also, at least in this case, the 3 materials which have the same particle size or the same mesh size, they all had in the ballpark of similar diffusion values. It was hard to distinguish between the materials. But then when we looked at, we had a bentonite clay, which happened to be a much smaller particle size. And in that case, I put just the order of magnitude results here for the diffusion coefficient, but we had several order of magnitude decrease in diffusion coefficient that was paralleled with the smaller particle size. So we haven't investigated this further, but it seems like from these initial results that particle size might be more influential on the diffusion coefficient rather than the specific type of material that you're looking at. And then certainly that temperature, the higher temperatures, you had increased diffusion, which makes sense.
Brilliant, thank you. A question here asks, was it difficult to prepare the samples for experimental analysis? And would the sample preparation affect surface characteristics such as porosity or sorption properties?
So for us, for many of the materials, we either worked with powders or sieved materials. And so for the sieve materials, we would then try to get at least a window. So like the 60-80 mesh is equivalent to 180 to 250 microns. So the sample prep usually isn't too difficult unless you have a material that clumps together. And so then that particle size might not be reflective as well as like if you have a really powdery material, you could try to sieve it and that's not really particle size. It's just how the material is clumping together in different pieces. In terms of how it would affect the results, I think we didn't do like necessarily complete control experiments, but this is a good example of when you make different sample columns, how there can be variety. So it is helpful to make multiple sample columns and compare the results. And then depending on the heterogeneity of your material, that's really what impacts the results. So for the more sorbent materials, or not the more sorbent, but the more homogeneous materials like that porous polymer, we made several different columns and it didn't really matter. So that would you tried to pack it similarly, but we weren't paying like tons of attention to it except by like tapping the column and making sure we got the material inside. So I think it could have some impact, but it seems like the heterogeneity of the material itself might be more influential than how you pack the column.
Yeah, I agree with that. And also there's also difference between natural materials and synthetic materials. So it's always the variability of experiments in case of natural materials is always bigger, and it's because they are natural materials, so you don't have much control on the sample surface or the properties. So that's why it's really important to do more columns, more experiment. In case of these materials, if it's a synthetic materials, of course, less error and less deviation between experiment. Yeah. It's very important. And a good question, by the way.
Yeah, it is a good question. And sometimes we did notice this too, and I actually think the 10xTA that I'm showing here with the light pink and then the darker red, I think the light pink were actually smaller sample sizes, and I don't remember offhand, but like these could have been, you know, like 100 milligram columns versus like 1 gram columns. And so sometimes you might see that there is an impact on the size of your column. And for some of them, I'm not sure what's dictating it, but it could be, you know, if you have a larger column and a very absorptive material, you're going to have to change the length of your run. And so there's a chance you're maybe not capturing the full peak. And so that's why we might have shifted to the smaller column so that we didn't have to have like hours and hours of runs, but instead like capture it in like a 30-minute analysis. And so then you can be sure that you're getting your complete peak.
Brilliant, thank you. And our last question here for today. Do you think that research on geological materials would benefit from a standardized method of analysis? And if so, why?
So I think it always helps to have, well, I guess in terms of standardized methods, one, if there was a standard that you could run, and so that you could have, so on my instrument, I could test that, oh yes, we do Henry's constant and we're getting consistent results with a standard. That would be fantastic, because then you would have more trust that when you're comparing results between other laboratories that you kind of have a calibrated baseline. So that would be really helpful. Certainly in the work that we've done so far, and I talk a little bit about this in our Langmuir paper, it goes into more detail. I think there was a series of work people have looked at heat of the absorption of zeolites using like hexane. And we, in that paper, kind of compiled all this in the literature and compared the results. And so that gave a perception of like how consistent things were. And there was variability, but you know, things might be in like the relative similar order of magnitude. So having some sort of calibrated standard would be really useful. And then in terms of what we've done in collaborating with SMS, a good example was that zeolite 13X. So they made the measurement at 100 degrees Celsius and we had made measurements at 110. And those results were really spot on, which is super exciting because it's not necessarily a calibrated standard, but it's the same sample material. And so that's just like something to keep in mind. And then similarly, like I think another folks have like looked at 10xTA and they were getting some similar results to us for one set of measurements. So certainly having a standard would be great just for a calibration, and the closer that standard can reflect your material of interest is helpful.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Yeah, I think that is all our questions for today. So I'd once again like to take the opportunity to extend my severe gratitude to Dr. Elizabeth Denis for being with us today to share her research, and for Dr. Condor for always being there to provide her expertise on IGC. So thank you both so much for taking part today.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was tremendous.
Yes, thank you, John. And yeah, thank you again, Elizabeth, to accepting the invitation. It was a pleasure to having you.
Of course, I think thank you to our audience and to both of our speakers. Just to let everyone know, if you missed out on the start of today's webinar or would just like to perhaps play it for your colleagues, it will be added next week to the Zorption Hub. This is our online Zorption portal, which has all of our webinars as well as additional e-learning content. And if you're an instrument user, it has help desks and support from our after sales team. So once again, I'd like to express a huge amount of gratitude to Dr. Elizabeth Denis for being here today. If you have any questions for Dr. Denis or Dr. Condor for anything discussed today, please don't hesitate to email us at science@surfacemeasurementsystems.com, and we'll be sure to put you in touch with the respective speaker. So thank you once again to our speakers, and thank you to our audience for being with us today. Have a wonderful afternoon or evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Bye, everyone.